You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello and welcome to the Catholic Mama podcast. I'm your host, Christine Mooney Flynn, as well as...
Hello.
It's the husband, Pat.
Back again.
It's
Always
Pat.
a joy to be on my favorite podcast, the Catholic Mama.
Isn't that fun?
Yes.
Who knew?
It is.
You told me
It
to start
is.
this podcast about a little over 2 years ago, and I laughed at you.
Yep.
And look where we are.
Yeah, it's really something.
Yeah.
It really is. Honestly, I am always surprised to hear about its growth, wonderfully surprised. And it's a work of God's grace. It really is. I mean, funny thing, I've been podcasting for longer than you. I've been in the online world for a long time. I have, pretty decent, I guess, platform sizes, if you will. But your platform has seen a higher rate of growth than mine on the podcast. And that delights me because, a lot of my business is, I do a few segments here and there on philosophy and theology, but a lot of it is on fitness and business and writing.
Right.
And I would much rather see the growth in, of course, any efforts of evangelization. And plus, these conversations are so much more fun and enjoyable.
Well, we're going to talk about sex today.
That's what we're going to talk about.
Whoever thought we'd be talking about sex on the Catholic Mama? I didn't.
I try to imagine if somebody would have told me even just like 4 or 5 years ago that I would be talking about sex on a Catholic podcast, Catholic Mom's podcast. I would have just turned around in circles. I don't know what I just would have had no idea what to make of a statement like that. But
wouldn't
here
that be
we
fun?
are.
I really wish that we could go back because I can't even imagine, say 5 years ago when we were both steeped in atheism, for somebody like, hey, you guys are going to become on fire for the Lord. Start Catholic, completely upend your life. Oh, there goes the chair again.
And have a bunch of children. Yeah, sorry, I'm in this really squeaky chair. So
As
I'll
always,
just sit.
it's the Pat Flynn chair.
I'll be stiff I'll just try to stay stiff as a board here.
So long overdue because it's been several weeks of fighting injustices on the internet.
My goodness gracious!
Railing against socialism and Marxism
and the signaling mob. Interesting study. I sent you. I sent you the link. Can we mention that?
Yeah, please.
I'll link it in the show notes. But there was a study done, and I haven't read the whole thing, but I made my way. I gave it the old Pat Flynn skim. And which is it's a sufficient skim. I'm actually want to print it out before a road trip and take it with us. But what they found is that it was a psychological study, and I couldn't believe it when I was reading it. But what they found is that it was a psychological study, and I couldn't believe it when I was reading it that they even did this study, but they did. And again, we'll link it in the show notes if people want to see it. But they found that those types of people who, quote-unquote, virtue signal, which is a term that's used, and constantly try to claim victim status for themselves, tend to be Machiavellian, narcissistic, and psychopathic. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all psychopaths, but they're on a certain degree of all of those things, which I think for people who've been online for a while and have been abused by these internet mobs, right, for stepping out of the narrative and which I do all the time. So I'm used to them. I've been hounded by these people for a long time, and you have to deal with it in Christian charity. But there's always been an obviousness about it, that when people act like this, you have to question, do you really care about attention to yourself? And what the study affirms is what most people see as obvious anyways, that there's sort of a sick, twisted narcissism here, and that people get this sort of, they see a benefit in being really loud and shrill online because it gives them this false sense of righteousness and virtue, or if they claim a certain victim status, it gives them a certain amount of attention, which feeds into narcissism. Now, you want to be somewhat careful when you start getting into, psychologizing people, because it could be the case that somebody's acting like this for exactly these reasons, but they might still be acting towards something that is a worthy cause or a just cause. So you have to evaluate these things independently. But I just was tickled in a sense when I saw this study. Well, can't believe they actually put this out there. It'll be retracted, I'm sure. They've be retracted, I'm sure. They've any study that's come out recently that's gone against the narrative, like they retracted that MSU study on the police. Yeah, can you believe this?
No kidding.
The Michigan State University study that broke the narrative of systemic racism
the
in
2019
police. Yes. So they retracted this study, right?
Wow.
Because of the backlash. Because of course people were using this study, like I did, and saying like, look, when you look at the research, like what people are saying versus reality, it's just not there. And so of course people couldn't tolerate
the truth
that this is the truth. And so there's a huge backlash. They retracted the study, and two scientists at Michigan State University, one of his name is Steve Sue, I think his name is, HSU. You can look this up. He's a physicist there. He did a podcast just talking through the study, just talking about the research that was done. Didn't seem like he took any political stances or anything. The mob got him. He wasn't forced to resign his teaching position, but he was in some other position he was forced to resign. He has tenure, so I think. But it's just so nasty. It's just terrible stuff, and it really should cause everybody to worry about. I mean, if you're not already worried about our culture and academia, of just how politicized, science. People say the science, right, as if it's not a human endeavor that isn't prone to all this nonsense. Yeah. It is. Yeah. So, I mean, there's been study after study. I mean, the Cornell study, they questioned the whole transgender ideology, showing that it was this weird psychological phenomenon that a bunch of teenage girls are just hopping onto all of a sudden. They retracted that one. Anything that goes against the mainstream narrative right now is just it's really kind of freaky, the power that this mob mentality has. So now that we have a study coming out that's saying that a lot of these people in the mob are narcissistic, Machiavellian, come for this thing.
That's right. Quick print it out.
Yeah, quick print it, save it. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah. That's a while back. I had somebody reach out to me on Instagram because I had posted it's something. I have a background. My background is in research. And one of the first things you learn is, follow the money trail or the influence trail when it comes to these kinds of studies, because, and this goes even after the study. Somebody's probably either they're funding that department and they're threatening to pull the money out now that they published this study, or any number of things. These are human beings conducting research,
yes.
So it is fallible.
Yep.
But even retroactively,
social pressures,
social pressure.
These things apply.
We have
right?
these biases,
and we hope to have mechanisms in place like peer review, but there's still an irreducibly human element to all of this. But the point is like intellectual human element to all of this. But the point is like intellectual virtue and courage only matters in times like these, right? Like you don't really need it when the questions are easy or there's no pressure against you. It only matters in times like these, and it's so sad to see people just caving left and right to this insane cultural mob.
Well, I told you, a couple weeks ago, I was in prayer and I was asking God, I was like, "What is the point of this? Why?" And immediately, the answer that popped into my mind was to separate the chaff from the wheat, and that's where we were talking about this just yesterday, where you got to pick a side right now. Are you the chaff or are you the wheat?
There's going to be a point where you're just not going to be able to sit on the fence anymore, and I think the point is getting closer and closer, and it's better to get off sooner than later. Trust me. But anyways, that was not meant to be the topic for today, but I thought it was one with. But
so
yes.
That's what we've been talking about the past few weeks. But we did start a 3-part series, and we did 2 of them. So now is the grand finale of talking about sexual ethics and Catholic morality. What is the purpose of the sexual act?
Yes.
Marriage, etc.
Yeah.
And so we've made our way through. I think in the first episode in this little mini series, we talked about the natural law theory. Correct?
Yes. Traditional natural law.
Yep. Yes. Thank you.
Not to be confused with new natural law theory.
Oh. Okay.
We don't like new natural law theory.
Traditional natural
Actually,
law.
I'm kidding. There's some good Catholics who engage in new natural law theory. I just think that it's metaphysically inadequate. But anyway, we'll take a quick break because we got a baby waking up. And we are back. Okay, baby is back asleep, and we're ready to keep going. So, yes, you're right. I think it's been a while now, but I think we gave this sort of 10,000-foot overview of traditional natural law theory. This sort of 10,000-foot overview of traditional natural law theory of how the sort of norm of morality can be judged approximately by understanding human nature and what perfects and fulfills human nature. And once we have the kind of twin pillars of what's known as essentialism and teleology, that things really have essences or nature, and teleology is the realization that natures are pointed toward a particular end or a certain effect or a range of effect that really perfects them, and that the good is in large aspect a functional concept, and that this applies to the human person as a whole, meaning that we are ultimately perfected. Our highest good is attained by coming into a loving, saving, eternal friendship with God and the beatific vision, to know everything about everything and to love in the most profound sense. But there are many other, for our body, nutritious goods, goods of physical health. There is the sexual faculty. There's a proper perfection of the sexual faculty within the marital union, which we talked about, and marriage itself is a natural institution. It's an institution provided by nature for the good of the human species in general, for not just the generative act, which leads to the begetting of children, but also, very importantly, the rearing of children. And it's the begetting and rearing of children is the primary and proper end of the sexual act, which is that sort of binding force for marriage. And it makes it an indissoluble bond, because children take a long time to rear, and under normal healthy conditions. And again, the natural law goes by what is normal, not the exception or what is accidental. You have multiple children, so once and at that point, any legitimate reasons you would have had for separation, very likely probably don't apply at that old age. Plus, I am owed your love and companionship. There's the secondary ends of marriage, which we should also talk about, not just the generative act, but the secondary ends of love, companionship, fulfilling certain desires like the sexual desire that continue on even after the primary end of begetting and rearing children has been accomplished. So that is a very terse and concise overview of a lot of the ground that we've covered. And what else did we have to talk about? Did we talk about birth control?
No.
No, we didn't talk about birth control, right? Well, the nice thing about a lot of what we did talk about is once you have the principles in place, it's not hard to draw conclusions about. Have the principles in place, it's not hard to draw conclusions about specific acts.
Which is why this is a 3-part series, because we had to lay that groundwork.
Correct.
At the beginning.
Right. So once you understand that the sexual faculty, like anything else, has a proper end, a proper perfection, a proper orientation, you can then start to make really good philosophical sense of disordered acts of it, right? Of acts that go against the moral norms. And these include everything from homosexual behaviors to masturbation and birth control. And birth control is an intentional and when we say birth control, we really mean artificial contraception, chemical, physical means, stuff like that, right? We'll talk about the natural family planning and the rhythm method here in a second. And what you're doing is you're intentionally frustrating the natural end. A really more perverse thing about it, and again, this is why it's important to consider not just the single act, but the whole of the human person, is it's perverse because you're trying to derive just the pleasure from the act, but eliminate its primary good, which is the begetting and rearing of children. And this is similar, we gave an analogy before, of some sense of eating disorders, of bulimia. You eat food, you want to derive the pleasure from it, but you don't want the nutritive good, the proper good of food for the health of your body. And everybody recognizes, again, until culture decides to go insane again and indoctrinate people out of it. Yeah, we might get it, right? That this is a bad act. And we think it's not just physically bad. There's something kind of morally wrong about it, too. There is. And the natural law, again, is very intuitive. As Scripture says that God wrote the moral law in all of our hearts. This is true. A lot of this stuff is intuitive, but we have philosophy to kind of work through the specific details, and we have revelation to shine a sort of special clarity on it as well that extends, and a sort of special clarity on it as well that extends. So yes, once we have those principles in place, we can see that with birth control, it's sort of like an eating disorder applied to the sexual appetite. That's what's immoral about it. And you start to use other people as an instrument, right? And rather than an end in themselves, you really start to use them as a sort of masturbatory device, and it becomes very perverse, and it can cause a person to become unduly attached to material pleasure, sexual pleasure, which is not a bad thing, right? So in the Catholic tradition and traditional natural law, we see sex as a very good and beautiful thing, just like eating is a very good and beautiful thing in its proper relation, when it is properly ordered. It's when it gets disordered that it can really corrupt a person, that it really corrupts a person's soul. So we're not like uber prude Puritans or anything celebrated. It's to be enjoyed. But like anything else, just like just as you can become overindulgent with eating or develop eating disorders, or you can become incredibly lazy, or you can even become obsessed with exercise to the point that becomes unhealthy and destructive as well. The sexual act is not, I don't want to say it's no different, because it is different, because it has such a power over people in the way that a lot of other things don't, that it's more prone to overrule our rationality because the passion is so strong. That's what makes it especially pernicious, is the passion of the sexual appetite is so strong. And it has to be, right? Because we need to procreate, right? That's why nature makes it as desirable as nature does, as God has designed it, because that is such an important thing that we partake in, like eating, that of course we're going to be very passionate about it. But the danger is those passions can easily overrule reason. If we're not thinking straight, if we're not careful, if we're not staying within the bounds of Catholic orthodoxy.
I mean, the entire culture is steeped in a disordered sexual mindset.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah, and what a weak and pathetic thing. Honestly, it is, that so many people fall to it. It's kind of the ironic thing is, don't try and you just want to be a slave to the church and your indoctrination. At the same time, people can't get their eyes off of the porn websites and the video games, and they can't stop eating their fast food. It's like, who's really enslaved here, right?
Well, I love the Catholic freedom for excellence concept, which is just phenomenal. But it's not that we are, like you said, a slave to the church. It's that the church knows in her wisdom, because it's guided by God and God created the church, to give us guidance on how we can become saints, how we can become excellent shall nots, but also do's, that we come up with that.
And there's lots of do's, right? Morality isn't just refraining. There's positive moral obligations. For example, we have positive moral obligations to care for our children and to teach our children the faith and to teach our children the virtues and all those things. And that, of course, all has import and, again, binding force on our marriage and the sexual act. It all needs to be considered. It's all connected. Everything matters. So the kind of question that comes up once you can see, okay, well, all right, I can maybe see, why birth control, you can make a strong philosophical case about it, even apart from the church. Well, what about natural family planning? That's what comes up. And this is often misunderstood by people, natural family planning. So it deserves a little bit of nuance and attention. So the idea of natural family planning is, it's, I guess, traditionally called the rhythm method, right? Where you time family planning is, it's, I guess, traditionally called the rhythm method, right? Where you time the sexual act, around the times when you're least likely to get pregnant, right? And the idea here is this is a principal difference than using contraception, chemical or physical birth control, because you're working in accordance with something that nature has itself provided, which God has provided in nature. I want to be clear again. When I say nature, I don't mean like Mother Nature or the universe or some weird pantheism. We mean like human nature, which is created ultimately by God. it's one of those things that the way modern culture uses nature is very different than how we use it in traditional natural law. Now, intention is very key here, right? Because the primary, again, act of marriage and sexual intercourse is oriented towards the begetting and rearing of children. So, thing is perfectly legitimate. You may have reasons, good principled reasons, to abstain from an otherwise normal, healthy act, right? That's why there's nothing wrong with fasting. In fact, fasting can be very healthy from time to time when done in the right way. So there's a difference between kind of perverting a faculty and abstaining from an otherwise normal and healthy act, right? So there's a difference between eating a bunch of food and throwing it up versus I just shouldn't eat right now either because I'm not hungry or my doctor said I should fast, so I'm going to just abstain from that normal and healthy act. And so that's a principled way to think about the distinction between using chemical or physical forms of contraception versus just using the rhythm method, abstaining from the sexual act, so long as both parties consent. Both parties have to consent to this because you do owe, in the marriage contract, the sexual act to your partner if they want it, if they desire it. That's something we can also get into. Now, that being said, general sense, but the church also teaches that the rhythm method is really something that you use only when you have a reason, for a principled reason for not wanting to either have kids right now or have any more kids. And traditionally, these reasons are going to come down to you have a serious medical issue, for example, a serious medical issue, or there might be a eugenic issue, right? Some type of reason to think that there might be a cause of severe birth defects or something like that. So medical, eugenic issue, severe economic issue would be another legitimate reason. Now, the people, this is where you have to be careful because people sometimes say, we can't really afford to have more kids right now. BS. Like, just BS, right? Like, severe economic strain is really afford to have more kids right now. BS. Like, just BS, right? Like, severe economic strain is a legitimate reason for practicing the rhythm method, but the truth is most people who would want to, or who have claim to, who be in that type of distress really aren't in that distress. So really, it has to be a form of distress or war, right? Some type of war going on, something like that. So you really need to have some principled reason of why you're right now abstaining from engaging in the generative procreative act when using the rhythm method.
Yeah.
Yes,
based on that criteria, it seems like most Western Catholics, barring a deep medical issue or something, would not have a reason.
Catholics should be having more kids. I mean, let's just be honest. The sad state of affairs is most Catholics just don't even think there's an issue with birth control, period. So it's just it's just and the church.
It's yes, and it's up into through very, very recent times. The church has continued to affirm her teachings on contraception.
Right. So it would be wrong, right, if you were to say we're going to engage in the rhythm method, and if you're doing it with the intention because I just want the pleasure of sex without kids, that would be wrong, right? Because now you have the similar intention that you had if you were using chemical or physical contraception.
Right. I have a trip planned in 3 months. I don't want to have morning sickness, so we have to do. Yeah.
So the important key insights here is that the means might be legitimate, the rhythm method is, but we also have to consider the intentions as well. So you need to have the right intentions for it to really be a legitimate thing that you're practicing. Now, illegitimate, like physical and chemical contraception, and certainly abortion, right? It's just such a grave moral evil. But all of these are serious evils in terms of contraception. But same thing, even the rhythm method, if you have that intention of saying, if you think of it's just like a loophole, right, where I just get to have sex without kids, that's a serious sin. That is a serious sin, right? So this is a legitimate means, but it's only a legitimate practice under legitimate circumstances. That's the key to natural family planning. And if people are made a little uncomfortable by that, guess what? Christine and I were too at first, right? We were studying this and going through it. We say, we have no legitimate reason not to be welcoming more kids into the world right now.
Yeah, I mean, you and I, for health reasons, were against chemical birth control from the start.
Yeah, Catholic.
Yeah. But then, we became Catholic, and I still got rid of all the baby clothes. I was like, but three, please. In this day and age, that's plenty. How could we afford it?
The sick culture really just seeps into you. It does.
Yeah, but then you look, I mean, not so very long ago, my grandmother had 10 kids.
10, yeah.
And my grandfather owned a dinky little newspaper. And they lived in, humble means, but they managed with 10 kids. And sure, you could say, it wasn't as expensive back then. Well, we've geared our lives now to require, we in general, like culturally, we have created these lives and lifestyles that require two incomes because we want to have multiple vehicles or certain vacations or whatever. Is that having your vacation or having the clothing budget that you would prefer, or your makeup budget, or whatever it is, the clothing budget that you would prefer, or your makeup budget, or whatever it is that really worth? Do you want to stand in front of God at the end and say, I didn't give you, I didn't become the steward of more souls for you because I wanted to go on a vacation?
Yeah, we asked each other that, and we said, heck no, I don't want to stand before God and have to explain that. But the truth is you think about it deeper too, is, what do kids kind of make you do? They make you make a choice. They make you make a choice of, you can't stay the same when you have one kid or when you have more kids. You either have to become more loving or more selfish. You can't stay the same. Kids demand so much of you, and more kids demand more of you. And so kids are such opportunities for grace. And yes, it's very difficult at times. Kids are difficult. Always saying that. So wonderful, so beautiful. I'm sure everybody listening, you wouldn't trade your kids for anything. That's it. You do have to make sacrifices for children, but it's a type of sacrifices that give you those opportunities for grace, to grow in holiness, to grow in charity, to be more self-giving as a mother, as a father. And that recognition is a beautiful recognition, and it's one we should run to embrace when we understand that. Now, again, we're not saying that there aren't legitimate means. The church does teach. There aren't legitimate circumstances. The church does teach that, and we all have to reflect on that, and act according to our best conscience, and seek counsel if we're unsure. Right? There's a lot of great, authorities in the church that you could ask for guidance on this if you're unsure. But as Christine says, certainly for most Catholics out there right now, you're probably
in the Western world,
in the Western world, probably not in those circumstances. So think of this more as an opportunity to not only grow in better love with your spouse, by really strengthening is really about, but also as those opportunities to usher in more souls into the world, and ultimately, hopefully, to God as well.
I did a podcast episode a while ago, which actually is one of my more popular ones, of why having more children is better for you. And I really did make the case that it does increase your creaturely dependence. The more children that you have, the more not only you have to rely on you have to rely on your spouse more. You have to be less selfish, like you mentioned. You have to rely on your parish or your community, family, friends who offer help to you. The stranger who says, "Can I push your cart back for you at the shop? At the grocery store?" Right. Whereas you might have only, if you have one or two children, you can get away with being in your own bubble.
Yeah.
But with the more children you have, the more you just have to, you're drawn out of yourself. You have to rely on others, which, the more children you have, the more you just have to, you're drawn out of yourself. You have to rely on others, which is good for you. And it's also good for others who are offering to help you.
Right. And one of my favorite contemporary moral philosophers, Alistair MacIntyre, really fascinating thinker. He's got a book out called Dependent Rational Animals. So oftentimes through the great classical tradition, starting, largely with Aristotle, of what is man? Well, man is a rational animal. MacIntyre says, well, that's true, but it's incomplete. We're also dependent rational animals. And so much of what perfects us is a lot of what you're talking about. And the virtues have to take our dependency into consideration, that others are dependent upon us, and we can grow in virtue and recognition of that, but also that we are dependent upon others, and we can grow in recognition of that, both in whether we're talking in compassion, empathy, humility. All these really important virtues do connect with the fact rational animals. Mm-hmm.
Now, somebody reached out to me and said, what do you do when you feel like you're going to get some flack from family or friends or even strangers about, oh, you're pregnant again? We have 4 kids that are 6 and under, and we joke that we're on the every other year plan. Mm-hmm. They just show up in the odd numbers. That's when the fertility comes back. But it is a moment. I would say start to prepare of what you will say, because the beautiful thing about children too, or being pregnant, is that it offers kind of a visible evangelization tool.
Oh yes.
So right around at the time that our 4th child was a newborn, I think we were out at Ray's Grain, weren't we? Anyway, somebody stopped by and they said, "How you're so calm? How are you doing this?" A lot of meditation. And, in the past I might have just laughed it off as, yeah, sure. And, in the past I might have just laughed it off as, yeah, sure. And I said, no, with a lot of prayer and God's grace or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's a small thing where it normalizes our Christian faith. And so I would think ahead. If you think that you're going to be having more children and you are a little nervous about what people may say, our culture, even a couple of years ago, I would think 3 children. That's crazy. Who has 3 these days? It's more than enough.
The more offensive we can be, the better.
Yeah, be an offensive Catholic by your lifestyle. But think about it and have a ready answer that, use that moment
and make
to evangelize.
And make it authentically joyful, as it should be.
Yeah.
Authentically joyful.
Yeah, actually, yeah. Somebody reached out.
It's wonderful news that you're pregnant again. It's literally such a gift from God. Every time. Well,
that was one of my biggest surprises when our firstborn was completely, I should say, we were unmarried, living in sin. And, you're only a 23-year-old guy at the time, and you said babies are always a blessing.
Yes.
And, of course, now I'm realizing that was your Catholic grandparents that got that into you.
Yes, they absolutely did. And, looking back, their example really left a mark on me. I mean, certainly I like to share a lot of the kind of intellectual steps I took to the Catholic faith, but there's deep personal and emotional steps too, and my grandparents are a big part of that. And, one of their children had a similar situation to us, even younger. He and his wife, or girlfriend at the time, got pregnant. And, for my grandparents, there's just no question about it. It's a blessing. Right, and they insisted they live at their house. They helped take care of the child as they sent my uncle. He wound up getting an incredible job and has done extremement well for himself.
But at the time, your grandparents were not wealthy people by any means, living in a little row home,
dinky, yeah. lower middle class, very financially strained. But yeah, it's something that growing up, I thought I wasn't paying much attention to, but it obviously left its marks on me. And as I was certainly considering the Catholic faith and reflecting back on 2 of the most beautiful people in my life and seeing why they were so beautiful to me is because they really lived the Catholic faith.
Yeah, when we weren't Catholic, neither of us would have seen that.
Right.
So, of course, strangers, I tell you, if you have, and I'm sure anybody listening, if you had 2 children closely spaced, or 3 kids or whatever, somebody say, well, did you plan it this way? And my advice to somebody recently was to say, no, it's God's plan, and we'll be happy to accept any child that God wants to get wearied by your kids.
You don't have to apologize. Never apologize.
Yeah, you don't have to apologize for it. That's right. It's a beautiful gift.
Not. Yeah. And yeah, so that's about it. I mean, that's a general overview. Again, if people want to dive deeper, and I suggest you definitely do, because I think one of the most rewarding certainly studying philosophy is rewarding in and of itself, but what will really edify you in the faith is to see why the Catholic Church is so right and so true. And just because you don't see a reason for a church teaching doesn't mean that there isn't a reason for a church teaching.
That's a really good point.
Just because
you can trust the church.
You can trust the authority of the church. This is God's church. And you can trust it if you look for a reason. Really look. You'll find one. You'll find a good one. So I was quoting from this book in a couple other previous episodes. I'll just mention it again. It's called Right and Reason by Father Austin Fagothy. And the subtitle is Ethics in Theory and Practice Based on the Teachings of Aristotle and St. Thomas. This is a wonderful teachings of Aristotle and St. Thomas. This is a wonderful introductory textbook to traditional natural law, and it's a great balance between accessibility and rigor. So that is always one of the first ones that I recommend for people.
It's been a while since I've read it. For anybody who's just curious about the church teaching on sexuality, is Humana Vitae good?
Yeah, Humana Vitae is a great one. Theology of the Body is also a nice place to start. But yeah, I mean, if you want they're drawing from the traditional natural law, but if you want kind of the first principles,
sure.
I mean, you can really just go right to start with Aristotle, read the primary text like the Nicomachean Ethics, and of course you can read all the virtues in Aquinas. But if you want a nice starting text, definitely grab Right and Reason by Father Austin Fagothy. And
natural family planning is an umbrella term for various methods. But if you want kind of an overview, if you're just curious and you don't know much about it already, you can look. I think the USCCB website. If you look up there, they have a whole section on natural family planning as well. I'm not an expert in this, so on all the different methods,
right?
And usually, in some dioceses. There might actually be a natural family planning, point person that you can reach out with your questions. I know there is one in our archdiocese. There's one or two women that you can reach out to, and they'll give you guidance and resources and all that sort of stuff. So, take advantage of what the church offers, in a very practical sense as well.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, I'm glad we finally got this series finished up.
Yeah. So I will link back to the first 2 episodes that we did in the show notes, as well as some of the resources that we mentioned. Pat, thank you very much. We are off. We're going to be waking up in 6 hours.
Oh, boy.
Because we have found our lovely children do best. I'm sure many parents of young children will also agree. So we'll be up at 3:30 in the morning on our way to the great state of Michigan.
See you there.
See you.
It's one of those awkward sign-offs. It's like when you're going on a flight. Enjoy your flight. You too.
Oh, yeah. Happy birthday, you too. Enjoy your movie. You too.
Yeah, Enjoy your food. You as well.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.